In the late 1990s, Britain was the envy of the financial world. Debt at historic lows, London drawing billions in foreign investment, growth everywhere you looked. 2 decades later, the United Kingdom is going broke. Public debt has soared, vital services have been slashed, and the financial machine that once powered prosperity now teeters on crisis after crisis. How did a country that built its fortune on financial daring end up fighting to stay solvent? The answer starts in the moment of Britain's greatest triumph, a choice that would quietly set the stage for disaster. At the turn of the millennium, Britain's financial heart pulsed with confidence. The City of London towered above its rivals, drawing in a flood of foreign capital that reshaped the skyline and filled government coffers. International banks and investors clamored for a foothold, attracted by a stable currency, business-friendly rules, and the promise of quick, lucrative returns. In 1999 alone, overseas investment in the UK reached £183 billion, outpacing every other European economy. The government's debt hovered near historic lows, at just over a quarter of GDP. For policymakers, this was proof that the strategy was working. London had become the engine of national prosperity. The numbers told a story of growth. Gross domestic product surged through the late 1990s and early 2000s, outpacing most G7 peers. Unemployment fell to its lowest point in decades. British households watched property values climb and new jobs appear in finance, law, and technology. The Treasury boasted of record tax receipts, much of it flowing straight from the city's trading floors. Even outside London, the ripple effects were felt. Regional economies benefited from investment, rising demand, and the expansion of professional services. Political leaders and business giants celebrated this new era, crediting the city's openness and ambition. The Bank of England, reformed and newly independent, was seen as a steady hand on the tiller. Across the world, London symbolized modern finance, fast, global, and innovative. The sense of security was real, built on strong balance sheets and the belief that Britain had finally cracked the code of economic success. Few questioned how much the nation now depended on its financial sector. Fewer still imagined that the same forces driving this prosperity could one day threaten it. For now, the numbers seemed unassailable, and the future looked bright. On the morning of October 27, 1986, a single Act of Parliament rewrote the rules for the City of London. The Big Bang reforms, championed by Chancellor Nigel Lawson alongside Bank of England Governor Robin Lee Pemberton and City regulator Ian Hay Davison, swept away decades of tradition. Fixed commissions vanished. The centuries-old divide between stockbrokers and jobbers dissolved overnight. Foreign banks and investors, once kept at arm's length, were now invited to buy up London's financial houses. Within months, American and Japanese firms snapped up storied British names, bringing new capital and a hunger for risk. The city's trading floors, once dominated by handshakes and handwritten ledgers, turned digital. Screens replaced paper. Deals moved at the speed of light. For the first time, the world's biggest banks could operate in London without local partners or limits. Foreign ownership of city institutions soared, and competition for profits intensified. The old guard, some uneasy with the pace, found themselves outflanked by global giants willing to take bigger bets. Warnings surfaced even in those early days. Internal memos from the Bank of England flagged the dangers of rapid deregulation. Davison, tasked with overseeing the transition, cautioned that the new system lacked clear checks on risk-taking. Critics inside Parliament questioned whether the rush to modernise had stripped away vital guardrails. But the mood in the city was buoyant. Trading volumes exploded. Profits soared. London's reputation as a financial powerhouse reached new heights. Yet beneath the optimism, the foundations of vulnerability were being laid. The reforms that fueled London's boom also loosened the controls that once kept risk in check. By the end of the 1980s, the city was richer and more exposed than ever before. The seeds of future crises had been quietly sown, hidden beneath a surface of prosperity and innovation. Shortly after midnight on October 13, 2008, Alistair Darling sat in a Treasury office lit by the glow of urgent emails and the steady ring of crisis calls. The Royal Bank of Scotland, once the world's largest bank by assets, was hours from collapse. RBS's chairman warned the Chancellor, "The bank is within hours of running out of money." On trading screens, the bank's shares had already plunged 35%. Behind the scenes, the Bank of England rushed to extend emergency liquidity, £61.5 billion in secret loans, just to keep RBS and HBOS afloat. The scale of the lifeline was staggering, dwarfing anything in British financial history. By dawn, the government had committed to a £45 billion recapitalisation of RBS, taking a controlling stake and effectively nationalising the bank. The Treasury's decision, made in the dead of night, wasn't just about one firm. It was a stark gamble to prevent cash machines from freezing, businesses from losing credit, and the entire banking system from unravelling. Darling later wrote, "If we hadn't acted, the cash machines would have stopped working, and the country would have gone bust." The rescue didn't stop with RBS. Guarantees, asset protection schemes, and further bailouts followed, sending public debt on a steep new trajectory. Within weeks, Britain's fiscal position had changed overnight. The public purse now carried liabilities unimaginable just months before. Newspapers ran headlines about reckless bankers and taxpayer burdens, while markets wavered between relief and suspicion. The choices made that weekend would shadow every budget and spending review for years to come. For the first time in decades, the UK's financial might looked fragile, and the cost of saving it had been measured in tens of billions, all shouldered by the public. After the shock of the banking rescue, the government turned to a new solution: austerity. Between 2010 and 2015, more than a quarter of local government grants disappeared. In towns across England, council budgets shrank year after year. Over 340 libraries closed their doors for good. Youth services and public health programs were whittled down or vanished entirely. In the northeast and northwest, councils that relied most on central funding faced the deepest cuts, while wealthier southern boroughs weathered the storm with fewer losses. Nick Macpherson, then the Treasury's top civil servant, warned ministers about the risks. Cutting too far, too fast may help the books, but hurt the country long term. But the pressure to reduce the deficit outweighed those concerns. Frontline managers in social care and the NHS described a daily struggle to keep basic services running. "You're always cutting corners, choosing between bad and worse," said one council official. Hospitals, already squeezed by expensive private finance initiative contracts, reported growing deficits and growing waiting lists. Some trusts spent more on PFY repayments than on doctors. The effects rippled outward. Social care eligibility tightened, leaving hundreds of thousands without support. Maintenance backlogs grew in the NHS, and waiting times for treatment stretched longer. In the hardest-hit regions, the sense of abandonment deepened. Public resentment simmered as community centres closed, bins were left uncollected, and streets grew shabbier. The gap between London and the rest widened, fueling anger that would later find a voice in the Brexit vote. By 2015, Britain's public sector was leaner, but also weaker, less able to cope with future shocks, and less trusted by those it was meant to serve. Brexit hit Britain's economy like a slow, grinding brake. In the years after the referendum, the numbers began to tell a different story, one of lost ground and shrinking possibilities. The Office for Budget Responsibility put the cost in stark terms: a permanent 4% loss to GDP compared to staying in the European Union. Exports, once the pride of British manufacturing, fell 16% in real terms. Factories that had survived the global financial crisis now faced new hurdles: customs checks, paperwork, and tariffs that ate into already thin margins. At Honda's Swindon plant, executives pored over spreadsheets showing a 15% jump in costs per vehicle, all because of the new border. The decision came down in 2019. Production would end. 3,500 jobs gone. One Honda executive described it bluntly. "We couldn't plan production with the threat of tariffs. Swindon closure was inevitable." In Sunderland, a city built on car assembly and export, the fallout was personal. A resident who'd worked the line for 20 years put it simply, "Before Brexit it was hard. After, it's been impossible. My pay went down, bills went up." For families already stretched, the loss of steady work meant food banks and zero-hours contracts. Investment dried up as companies reconsidered the cost of doing business in Britain. The tax base shrank, less income, fewer exports, lower company profits, making it harder for councils and the government to fund services. The pain was not a single blow, but a steady erosion. Brexit's promise of new opportunity was, for many, replaced by uncertainty and a sense that something vital had slipped away. When the pandemic swept across Britain in March 2020, the government shut down shops, restaurants and offices almost overnight. The economic fallout was immediate. Millions faced sudden unemployment, and entire industries ground to a halt. To prevent mass layoffs, Chancellor Rishi Sunak announced the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme, better known as furlough. The Treasury promised to cover 80% of wages for workers unable to do their jobs, at a cost that would eventually top £70 billion. At its peak, more than 11 million jobs were supported. Alongside furlough, emergency business grants and bounce-back loans poured into high streets and factories, while the NHS received billions in extra funding to handle the crisis. But the speed and scale of support brought difficult choices. In July 2020, Sunak unveiled Eat Out to Help Out, a discount scheme for diners aimed at reviving the battered hospitality sector. Over 160 million meals were subsidised, costing the government nearly £850 million. Behind closed doors, senior officials debated the risks. Chief Medical Officer Chris Whitty warned of a likely spike in infections, but Sunak pressed ahead, arguing economic survival outweighed the threat of a second wave. Critics later blamed the scheme for fueling the spread of the virus, while supporters pointed to jobs saved in restaurants and pubs. By the end of 2021, the government's pandemic response had driven public debt above 100% of GDP, levels not seen since the aftermath of World War II. The cost of emergency measures, layered on top of lost tax revenue from closed businesses, left the Treasury with a mountain of new liabilities. As the crisis faded, the debate shifted: how to pay for the rescue, and whether the rush to spend had traded future stability for short-term relief. On the morning of September 23, 2022, the government unveiled a mini-budget promising sweeping tax cuts and unfunded spending. Within hours, global investors began dumping UK government bonds. Gilt yields, which had hovered around 3.5%, shot past 5% in less than 3 days, an increase not seen outside currency or default crises. Pension funds, many using leveraged strategies to match their long-term liabilities, suddenly faced margin calls on a scale they had never planned for. By the evening of September 26th, the Bank of England's financial stability team was holding emergency calls every hour, watching as the market for long-dated gilts buckled under the weight of forced selling. The numbers were staggering. More than £36 billion of gilts changed hands in just over 2 weeks, much of it driven by pension funds desperate to raise cash. Some funds were leveraged 3 or even 4 times over, amplifying their losses as prices fell. The threat was immediate. Without intervention, pension schemes risked insolvency, putting retirement incomes for millions at risk. Inside the bank, analysts modelled worst-case scenarios: a cascade of fire sales, evaporating liquidity, and the real possibility of a full-scale financial meltdown within 72 hours. At 11 a.m. on September 28th, the Bank of England announced it would buy up to £65 billion of long-dated gilts over 13 days, with a daily cap of £5 billion. The real purchases would end up closer to £19 billion, but the signal was clear. This was not a routine market operation. It was a last-ditch effort to prevent the collapse of a core part of the UK's financial system. For 3 days, central bankers worked round the clock, fielding calls from pension trustees, asset managers, and government officials. The crisis forced the entire financial architecture to its limits, exposing just how quickly confidence could vanish and how fragile the line between order and chaos had become. Britain's finances now operate within some of the tightest margins in living memory. The government's debt stands at 101% of GDP, with net liabilities reaching £2.87 trillion as of June 2025. Each new budget brings little room to manoeuvre. The deficit for the first half of the financial year has already reached £44.5 billion. Even as tax receipts rise, the cost of servicing this debt grows faster. 10-year government bonds now yield 4.5%, a level that places Britain among the highest-cost borrowers in the developed world. Every uptick in interest rates adds billions to the annual bill, diverting money away from public services and infrastructure. The current account deficit, at 3.8% of GDP, signals that Britain continues to buy more from abroad than it sells. Goods trade remains deeply negative, with a deficit of £56.6 billion, only partially offset by a £53.8 billion surplus in services, much of it from the city's financial sector. This imbalance leaves the country reliant on foreign capital to fill the gap, making the economy vulnerable to shifts in global investor sentiment. When markets grow uneasy, as they did during the 2022 bond crisis, the cost of borrowing can spike in days, not months. Policymakers face a shrinking set of choices. Raising taxes risks stalling growth and provoking public backlash. Cutting spending further means deeper pain for already stretched services. Borrowing more is expensive and watched closely by ratings agencies and bondholders. The leeway once available to previous governments has narrowed to a sliver. Markets, more than ministers, now set the boundaries of what is possible. The evidence points to a fiscal space so constrained that every decision carries immediate and visible costs, leaving little room for error or ambition. In 1990, UK public debt stood at just 28.3% of GDP, a symbol of its financial strength. But the documentary has traced a clear path from the 1986 Big Bang deregulation through the £45 billion RBS bailout in 2008 to the deep austerity cuts and the 4% permanent GDP loss after Brexit. Each crisis, from the COVID-19 spending surge to the 2022 gilt market turmoil, further narrowed the government's options. Today, the UK faces a current account deficit of minus 3.8% of GDP, and 10-year government bond yields near 4.5%. Some government files detailing key policy decisions and internal warnings remain closed, leaving the full picture incomplete. What is certain is that decades of financial risk-taking, external shocks, and structural decline have reshaped Britain's economic future. As the archival evidence makes clear, the choices made and the costs incurred are still shaping the nation's room to manoeuvre.